for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. I've been railing for the last couple of weeks about Educational Media Foundation. Well, somebody's jumped on the train with this one. We've got a great in-depth article about EMF, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Also, more people that don't believe in religion. We're now the majority in this country. People that are agnostic, atheist, none of the above. We're now the majority here, so you better listen to us. All right. Hey, majority rules, right? That's the way this country has always worked. Majority rules. So we're going to get to that. We got to talk about Trump. We got to talk about a newspaper that has had its edition stolen. We'll get you all the details of that in just a couple of minutes before we get to our topics for today. A couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern, and you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, so be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. We're recording this show on Wednesday, January 24th, 2024. It's the day before what would have been my dad's 91st birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. I hope I'm doing you proud. All right, let's get to our very first story here. I have been wanting this to happen for a long time, and now Educational Media Foundation is getting exposed, not by just Southpaws. Somebody over at Rolling Stone magazine must listen to Southpaws and heard me rail about this because they have done a full-blown article. This is very lengthy, but it's very important to understand what's happening in radio today. This is Katie Thornton writing for Rolling Stone magazine. This is dated January 21st. Looking out the studio window of the radio station where she'd worked for 29 years, DJ Mistress Carrie Sorreo could see a crowd gathering outside. It was a Friday night, February 21st, 2020. And freezing, but that didn't stop hundreds of Bostonians from flooding the parking lot where they heard the news, or when they heard the news. There was no invitation, just an impulse, an impromptu meetup of loved ones known and unknown. At midnight, the city would lose its last rock radio station. Debuting in 1970, WAAF helped launch the careers of local bands like Aerosmith and Godsmack, and put national groups like Shinedown on the map. To many listeners, the station was as much a part of Boston as Fenway Park and Clam Chowder. WAAF was Mistress Carrie's longtime colleague and fellow WAAF DJ Mike Sue told me, quote, a local Massachusetts club of troublemakers and assholes, end of quote. At big rock concerts, chants of AAF were as common as feedback. Sometimes WAAF loyalists would come to blows with devotees of their one-time competitor, rock station WBCN, before the latter went off the air in 2009. For Mistress Carrie, a 51-year-old purple-haired rock evangelist, WAAF was the soundtrack to her adolescence, as it had been for so many other Bostonians. In the days leading up to the end, the mood of WAAF was somewhat between hospice care and a rowdy Irish Catholic wake. Old friends flooded in, listeners called with high-octane send-offs. Aerosmith's Tom Hamilton stopped by to pay tribute. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, there was a quiet in the on-air studio. Mistress Carey's voice broke as she told her listeners to keep their heads high, shoulders back, and horns up. She said, quote, "We're going out proud because we're all part of something special," end of quote. Sue responded solemnly, "It was awesome," end of quote. 6 minutes before midnight, Mistress Carey and Sue taunted the soon-to-be owners of their beloved station. Mistress Carey said, quote, "There's only one way to go," end of quote. Sue stated, quote, "Loud," end of quote. Mistress Carey replied, quote, "In your face," end of quote. Sue declared authoritatively, "Evil," end of quote. Crackling in the background was the soft but ominous sound of rain falling and church bells ringing, the iconic opening of Black Sabbath's 1970 track Black Sabbath. The song was, according to Sue, quote, "handcrafted, especially chosen for the segue into the new format," end of quote. Intended, and Mistress Carey said, quote, "to inject as much Satanism in the airwaves as possible before we flip the switch," end of quote. With her voice breaking, Mistress Carey implored her listeners, quote, "Wherever you are, roll your windows down," end of quote. Sue yelled, "Crank it up," end of quote. Mistress Carey spat out, quote, "One last time, baby," end of quote, before screaming a chant that had rung through Boston's rock scene for half a century. She yelled, quote, "AAF, AAF," end of quote, with Sue joining in. About 150 current and former employees crammed into the adjacent office space opened the door to join in. Their chanting voices filled the airwaves, "AAF, AAF." With their final song growing louder, the DJs faded out the mics and closed the studio door. Mistress Carey said, quote, "And we sat there with our headphones on and cried," end of quote. Perfectly timed by Sue and Mistress Carey, the song ended at midnight, when an engineer came in and flipped a switch, ending WAAF's transmission once and for all. In the studio, all was silent save for the tears of Mistress Carey and Sue. Listeners, though, heard something else, the impersonal dawning of a new era. There was no flashy sign-on, no new local DJ to take the reins as the frequency changed hands. The new owners couldn't even be bothered to tip their hat to their new Boston audience with a shout-out or a song by a local artist. Instead, they just punched into their automated playlist, which emanates via satellite to hundreds of radio stations across the country, fading in mid-song. With the signature clean production and contemplative, easy pace of Christian rock artist Jeremy Camp's 2006 track Let It Fade invited listeners to be saved, to find new life. WAAF had just become the latest casualty in a string of radio stations all over the country, all lost to a massive but little-known nonprofit called the Educational Media Foundation. If you've ever wondered why it seems like every other station on your dial is Christian rock, EMF is a big part of your answer. From its headquarters in the Nashville suburb, the organization is slowly relocating from its longtime home of California. EMF plays the generic sounds of contemporary Christian music, or CCM. It is a genre that everyone from artists and critics to church leaders have decried as being somewhere between the absolute worst and doctrinally unsound. But the Educational Media Foundation has quietly become the country's fastest-growing radio chain and the second largest station owner in the country, bested only by iHeartRadio. With hundreds of cookie-cutter stations branded as K-Love, as well as its smaller chain of Air One stations, EMF broadcasts on more than 1,000 signals across the 50 United States and some U.S. territories, reaching an estimated 18 million listeners a week. On the surface, EMF's broadcasts are glaringly apolitical. They opt instead for their trite brand of DJ rock, all teed off by the same small cast of nationally syndicated Anywhere USA DJs who smile through everything from squeaky clean jokes about the drink sizes at Starbucks to prayers asking God to watch over those who have donated to the organization. But behind this politically neutral facade, the organization and the CCM industry more broadly appears to be an inherently conservative project. Many right-wing Christian culture bearers have long believed in the Breitbart doctrine, the idea that to change politics you must first change culture, and have fought for decades to build a parallel popular culture free of sharp edges, hard questions, or representations of lives that veer from the straight and narrow. The world of CCM, in turn, quote, reflects the values of the religious right. That, end of quote. That is according to Leah Payne, religious studies historian and author of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. EMF has done this by providing, quote, suburban families with safe Christian listening experiences in the car, end of quote. And while EMF stations may not have the, quote, attention-getting, rage-inducing content, end of quote, of an explicitly political outlet like Fox Propaganda Channel, she says, quote, K-Love is the softer side of that conservatism, end of quote. Yeah, so it's basically slipping in past you. It's like the fox that's passing the henhouse gate, getting ready to start slaughtering. Or maybe better yet, instead of the fox, because you can see them, it's the weasel, because you don't see them. You don't see them coming. Today, the organization's nationwide network of radio stations plays mostly white male artists. Though it professes to broadcast Christian music, it largely steers clear of genres like religious rap or gospel, as well as any Christian rock that grapples too heavily with doubt or hardship. Christian artists who have wavered in their faith have quietly been dropped from EMF playlists. Several queer Christian artists have lost work and airtime on CCM radio after coming out. Through a representative, EMF declined to be interviewed for this story and did not respond to requests for comment. Of course not. They want to stay in the shadows. They don't want to be exposed. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll expose them here every week if necessary. You can guarantee that. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, I absolutely hate Christianity. I think all organized religion is the bane of existence on this planet. So I'm going to expose them every single chance that I get to. Let me continue Rolling Stone's article. But EMF's story isn't just about bad music taking over the airwaves in service of a cultural vision that is overwhelmingly white, straight, and artistically regressive. It's also the story of the near demise of local radio, a longtime haven for new music, artistic outcast, and political dialogue, at the hands of a tax-avoiding, not-for-profit organization that appears to operate like a very much-for-profit media megacorporation. Like iHeart, like Cumulus, like Town Square, like Midwest, like Odyssey. All of them. For decades, EMF has hidden behind a veneer of uncoolness while honing a signature technique. At big commercial stations and small, beloved community radio stations alike, they've offered the owners an undeniable sum of money, wiped out the local presence, and replaced it with unmanned transmitters. Almost every new EMF station operates as a repeater with no local voices, few local jobs, and barely any overhead. As of 2022, the little-known organization had just shy of $1 billion in net assets, a number that grows steadily year after year, with an annual revenue of nearly $250 million. National Public Radio, by comparison, had net assets of less than $150 million and operated near the break-even mark. Let me compare it to Pacifica, which broadcasts our program. Pacifica is always in dire need of money. Always has been and probably always will be. That's why we ask you to support your local Pacifica affiliates. In 2021, EMF's then CEO Bill Reeves made a cool $770,000 a year, well over what NPR CEO made that year. Compensation data for EMF's current CEO Todd Woods has yet to be released. And listeners are the primary ones paying for that salary. 97 cents of every dollar the organization makes comes directly from listeners' pockets. EMF's on-air hosts repeatedly hound their sometimes hard-up listeners for money, often several times in an hour. With few operating costs, each new station quickly becomes a vehicle for new donations. While other radio companies sell off signals and struggle to keep advertisers, nonprofit EMF has built an unassuming money-making machine. In the WAAF studio that last fateful night, some staff were feeling whiplash. Just 3 years earlier, Sue watched as the station he grew up with, Brown University's WBRU in Providence, Rhode Island, was choked off the air in an EMF buyout. WAAF program director Joel Calgaro, sitting next to Sue, had his longtime dream of working at his hometown rock station, The Loop in Chicago, pulled out from under him when EMF bought it in 2018 for $21.5 million. In the case of Boston's WAAF, the organization paid more than $10 million for the signal. Instead of new rock bands and a few classic standbys, listeners in the Boston area can now hear a small and frustratingly catchy play-list of guitar-driven worship songs interspersed with promotions for EMF apps that allow you to listen everywhere, even the Chili's parking lot. Mistress Carey said, quote, "They might not ever say it out loud, but you can't tell me there isn't a little bit of pride that K-Love is taking the devil's music off the radio and buying rock stations out." End of quote. According to an interview with recent CEO Reeves on a Christian radio website, EMF's signal expansion team sits down together every 10 days to continue plotting its growth. The group of engineers, executives, and money guys look at stations that might be vulnerable to a buyout and hatch plans. And EMF build its kingdom by expertly exploiting loopholes that the Federal Communication Commission put in place to help small nonprofits and try to keep the broadcast spectrum from falling to those with the deepest pockets. In 2018, former EMF CEO Mike Novak told a radio industry magazine that, quote, "In my own heart, I know God was involved," end of quote, in the decision to form a 501c3, quote, "because being a not-for-profit has paid off for us many, many times," end of quote. To Mistress Carey, it didn't feel fair. When it comes to music radio, she says, quote, "They're playing on a completely separate set of rules than everybody else," end of quote. And they are. They are, because the FCC has set it up this way. But I got a way you can fix that. You need to call or write the FCC and tell them to change the rules and get rid of EMF. In 1978, Bob Anthony Fogle was working his dream job as a DJ at KFRC, a San Francisco rock and top 40 station that had been named Billboard Station of the Year 4 times in a row. But Fogle, who was 28 years old at the time with a bright smile, iconically 70s big frame glasses, and slightly shaggy beard, was also a recent convert to evangelical Christianity, and he was feeling unexpectedly unfulfilled. Sitting in his office, he scrawled an idea on a yellow pad of paper. Christian KFRC? At the time, a lot of Christian radio was still fringe, sharp-tongued preachers from small-town churches prophesizing about the end times. And while Fogle may have personally embraced this kind of religiosity, he had something else in mind for his radio station. He wanted to reach the masses. He wrote "No Christianese" on the paper with a bold underline. 2 years later, Fogle went public with his effort, forming the nonprofit that would soon be known as the Educational Media Foundation. They ran ads in the local paper with open invitations for anyone wishing to discuss the creation of a new Christian music radio station. They held early morning prayer gatherings and film screenings, raising money by charging $5 a head. It wasn't easy, but it was his calling. Fogle, who had been living a plush life in Marin County, would come to sell many of his belongings to make his vision come to life. By 1982, Fogle and his followers had scraped together enough to buy an FM station that had belonged to a bankrupt church in Santa Rosa, California. On the EMF flagship station, Fogle bucked Christian radio convention by almost exclusively playing music, all optimistic and Jesus-tinged. Though leaders of local churches scoffed, some audience members were so moved that they wanted to do more than listen. Volunteers put on concerts, created a newsletter, held an annual auction, helped solicit donations, and rallied listeners to pray for more frequencies. Their prayers were answered by Army-disciplined pop radio DJ Dick Jenkins, who came in as general manager in 1986. Jenkins rebranded the flagship station and began using the slogan Positive and Encouraging, K-Love, which the organization still uses today. It started negotiating buyouts, often with small, struggling Christian radio stations. New stations rebroadcasting K-Love sprung up around Northern California and eventually in some small towns and mid-sized cities throughout the country. With Jenkins at the helm, EMF's chain of near-identical stations grew steadily throughout the 1980s and 1990s. As the company built its broadcast network, one business decision proved to be peculiarly prescient: the choice to incorporate as a not-for-profit entity. Not only did that status let it avoid paying tax, it also gave EMF several legs up in the radio world. It allowed the organization to take advantage of long-held FCC policies intended to keep the radio dial from being sold to the highest bidder, such as waiving application costs and other fees for nonprofits due to their inherently limited funding. EMF also made use of a federal policy that let new nonprofit stations opt out of the requirement of having a local broadcast studio. Furthermore, EMF could legally get donations from listeners, a revenue stream commercial stations don't have at their disposal. Todd Urich, a radio engineer and community radio advocate in Los Angeles County, said that for EMF, quote, it was just a matter of expansion, end of quote. By the early 2000s, the nonprofit had well over 50 radio stations and was bringing in around $25 million in donations annually. In 2003, EMF leveled up again. That spring, the FCC set aside a week in which radio organizations could apply for radio translators. In essence, small repeater stations that rebroadcast a parent station into an area that the original signal couldn't reach. Translators are the fraction of the price of new stations and were easily available to nonprofit broadcasters like colleges, public radio stations, and community and religious broadcasters. After that March week in 2003, Urich was sifting through the FCC signal database to see who applied. He says, quote, EMF was a major filer of these translators, end of quote. In fact, the organization had applied for nearly 900 translator stations across the country, including coveted big signals in big cities. They get approved for more than 250. With an explosion of new translators broadcasting Christian music, EMF soared. By 2006, the nonprofit more than quadrupled its assets to more than $80 million. By the end of that year, EMF was the world's largest broadcaster of contemporary Christian music. But perhaps most disturbing of all is that from the beginning, EMF's nonprofit status has let it access a goldmine of frequencies, the storied left of the dial. The FCC has long reserved the lower FM band from 88.1 to 91.9 for exclusive use by groups including colleges, community and public radio organizations, and tribes. It's the stuff of subcultural legend and the inspiration for the replacement's 1985 Ode to College Radio left of the dial. With big commercial entities banned from bidding on these signals, the FCC imagined that small nonprofits could access them. But with a giant like EMF still entitled to these frequencies, small organizations have found it hard to compete. In 2015, listeners and staff at a classical public radio station in South Florida couldn't raise enough to buy back their frequency after it was sold to EMF. In 2017, not even a media-savvy campaign led by current and former Brown University radio staffers could keep the frequency out of EMF's hands. And in 2018, EMF bought Shaw University's Signal, which had been the first public radio station owned by a historically black college or university. The more than 2,000 signatures on Change.org weren't even a hiccup. Even as EMF grew into a giant, it still reaped the benefits designed to give small nonprofits a fighting chance on the radio dial. If you ask Urich, EMF has also been a behind-the-scenes bully. He says that he has run into several cases where EMF has made small engineering changes that have practically no effect on EMF's reach, but limit a nearby community broadcaster's coverage, or keep an organization that was hoping to get a new radio station from getting on the air. Like in 2013, when the nonprofit punk fanzine Razor Cake applied for a tiny Los Angeles area FM station on the same signal as an EMF translator down in Orange County, and EMF barraged it with complaints about potential interference. Zine editor Todd Taylor said, quote, It was kind of like the NFL going after a peewee team. They were just trying to bury us in paperwork. End of quote. By the way, the reporter on this article said that she was interviewed by Razor Cake last year and worked in community radio many years ago. Urick also says that over the years he has watched EMF buy up multiple translators in the same city, doubling, sometimes tripling their coverage. He said, quote, they hoard signals where they don't even need them, where they're extremely redundant, end of quote. And Urick says that takes away potential signals from community radio hopefuls. In cities and small towns alike, EMF moves in like a ghost, almost imperceptible but ever present, with virtually no local staff or local facilities, without paying the fees required of commercial radio companies and on frequencies unavailable to the commercial networks that are increasingly its competitors. But when asked in 2022 about EMF's localism or lack thereof by a Christian website, hisair.net, then EMF CEO Reeves put into a holy context, quote, well, the answer is pretty simple. That's just not what we are called to do at this time, end of quote. Not what he's called to do. No, because you want to hoard everything. You want to get rid of radio the way that it is and put it in the image of God. From her seat behind the microphone at WAAF in the 2010s, Mistress Carrie saw EMF's K-Love and Air One stations spreading to more and more frequencies, but she never saw them as a threat. She says, quote, I've always said it's my opinion that the devil writes better music than God. End of quote. She says the Christian rock was more of a punchline for her and her colleagues. But in the CCM industry, getting that immediately recognizable sound, however derided, has been a science. Grace Semler Baldridge, an independent Christian artist who performs as Semler and who has topped both the iTunes Christian albums and song charts, said, quote, you just can't be too heavy, end of quote. In addition to her own crop of frankly honest songs about her faith, she's done session work and built relationships with artists in the CCM industry. There, she immediately became aware of a few soft rules of the genre. First, she says there's a just right spot when it comes to beats per minute. Not too fast, not too slow. After beats per minute, there are JPMs, or Jesuses per minute. While there's no hard and fast rule on the required numbers of Jesuses per minute, more tends to be better. And a reference to him, God, Father, etc. counts, Semler says. Choruses should be rife with repetition so that listeners can sing along by the second round. The guitar must be warm but just a bit bright, with a touch of drive and a long tail reverb that hangs in the air. Most important, there's the delay, which nearly doubles the guitar's slowed strums and picked melodies, a technique that Reverb.com's The Gear, Tones, and Techniques of Modern Worship Guitar guide says was pulled directly from U2's The Edge. So they're not only stealing radio station signals, they're ripping off from actual artists like The Edge. In many ways, EMF helped shape this sound over decades. One evangelical church band member I spoke with called it K-lovification of Christian music. With hundreds of stations rebroadcasting a single K-Love feed, Christian artists and record labels saw that they had a singular opportunity. Instead of shipping CDs to dozens of stations the country over, pleading with program directors for airtime, and racking up long-distance phone bills, artists and their labels had to convince just one set of people that their song was worth playing, those deciding the playlist at EMF. In the 1980s and 1990s, K-Love could be heard playing Christian pop rock and crossover artists like Amy Grant. Its sister chain, Air One, focused more on Christian alternative music, anchored over the years by bands like De Talk and Reliant K. But over time, K-Love and Air One converged on a niche in the marketplace, the rock-tinged, undoubting pop of worship music. Or as Lee Payne describes it, quote, the sound of the megachurch, end of quote. The Christian music business's target audience member, whom industry leaders brazenly refer to as Becky, is a full-time mom who desperately wants a reliably unoffensive station to play in the car while carting the kids from school to soccer. With a suburban sound, the songs are just as easily heard on Sunday morning as in the car ride to school. While the idea that overdrive and a sizzling beat might fuel crises of faith may seem laughable, the history of Christianity's interminglings with rock is indeed a fraught one. Cliché as it is now, post-war Christian parents really were in an all-out panic about rock and roll. And for many white Christians, the dangers of rock and roll didn't just lie in the charisma of performers, their dripping sweat, and the promise of carnal satisfaction. Ingrained in many white evangelicals' disdain for rock was a deep-seated racist fear of the so-called race-mixing genre. In 1958, for example, while the staunch segregationist Asa Carter was leading an anti-rock and roll campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, masked members of the local KKK who identified as Christian sabotaged the antenna of a local black-oriented radio station, cutting it down and causing outages. But as the 1960s came to an end, the nearly unthinkable happened. Rock music and the burgeoning hippie lifestyle brought many followers to Jesus. While young paisley-clad members of the counterculture had come to the movement seeking peace and love, many found its drug-addled displays shallow and fleeting as their musical heroes died young and bands ended in cold-shouldered turmoil. Commodified, half-baked explorations of Eastern spirituality proved insufficient and even delusionary for some seekers. Many flower children found what they were looking for in Jesus, or in a new branding of the guy, who suddenly seemed to bear some anachronistic similarities in the hippies themselves, hair long, clad in sandals and loose, flowing clothing, vocally opposed to the government in power, like a Galilean Jerry Garcia. Across California, a handful of savvy men of the cloth worked with more streetwise evangelists, helping them to establish Christian coffee houses, havens like the Living Room near Haight-Ashbury, or his place on Los Angeles' Sunset Strip. Everyone from fresh-eyed teens to drying out 20-somethings flooded in to hear folk rock artists sing songs of praise and faith when doubt and salvation, or to sit on the floor of the caffeine-fueled come-as-you-are worship sessions that focused on Jesus' right-on teachings. Soon, popular bands were dabbling in the divine, with Norman Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky proclaiming that you gotta have a friend in Jesus, and the Byrds declaring that Jesus is just all right with me. In 1969, a motorcycle-riding coffeehouse regular named Larry Norman released what many critics considered to be the first Christian rock album, Upon This Rock. With a black ascot around his neck and PC blonde curtain bangs fanning out over his eyebrows, looking like a hippie Gwyneth Paltrow weary from preaching on a windy street corner all day, an activity he was known to do. Norman wrote for an audience of flower children disillusioned by the government and the church. That is according to the Christian Broadcasting Network. Across the pond, meanwhile, young composer Andrew Lloyd Webber and lyricist Tim Rice made a rock musical based on the life of Christ and his followers. The Jesus Christ Superstar album beat out Carole King's Tapestry to be the top-selling record of 1971. That year, a pop art-style Jesus adorned the cover of Time magazine with a halo of text reading, "The Jesus Revolution," arcing above the prophet's head. The Jesus freaks had arrived. Unfortunately, let me add. Many in the mainstream church found this new pop culture Jesus and his freewheeling followers blasphemous. But some religious leaders were willing to play the long game with these unlikely seekers, including the prominent evangelical minister Billy Graham, who preached God's love at rock concerts. In 1972, the Graham-adjacent youth-oriented group Campus Crusade hosted a 6-day event known as Explo 72 and often regarded as the Christian Woodstock. 80,000 high school and college-age hippie types flooded Dallas for prayer sessions and seminars on how to evangelize before enjoying evening performances by the like of Norman, who would soon release his pointed song Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music, plus special performances by Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson. While many people saw Explo 72 as the organic culmination of the Jesus Freak movement, many critics have since regarded it as something else, the moment when conservative evangelical leaders finally figured out how to begin to bend youth culture to their will. For many aging flower children, the music-driven ministry provided an easy path into the mainstream church and the budding CCM industry. By the late 1970s, the genre's rebellious roots had been excised, and contemporary Christian music, increasingly conservative in style and substance, even had its own Billboard charts. This was the world in which EMF founder Bob Anthony Fogle had the idea for his Christian KFRC. Like Graham and the holy men who helped shape the coffeehouse movement from behind the scenes, Fogle embraced the attitude that Christian music should meet people where they're at, even if that means playing increasingly vapid quasi-religious music. No Christianese remained a guiding principle. It is a strategy that has been central to Christian pop ever since. Use the music and aesthetic of the counterculture to ease followers' transition into mainline evangelicalism and build a quietly conservative wing of modern life by making CCM mainstream. Payne says, quote, Christian contemporary music is an effort to shape the world through popular culture, end of quote. CCM was useful in other ways too. The music helped keep young people coming back. Payne says, quote, it was about keeping church children in the church, end of quote. On K-Love today, you won't hear any explicit politicking. You didn't in the early days either. For one thing, its nonprofit status means it can't legally engage in any political campaign activity. Perhaps it was merely a coincidence when in the 1990s EMF applied to build a new K-Love station on the same frequency as a Northern California community radio station that had programs specifically for and by lesbians, prompting outcry from the existing station. But conservatism is in many ways baked into the business. Fogle had the early support of Watergate hatchet man turned evangelical political commentator Chuck Colson. Over the years, EMF staff has donated primarily to conservative political action committees. And though he was no longer involved with the company at the time, Fogle said in a 2022 interview that EMF was more necessary than ever, and that its enormity gave it, quote, tremendous opportunities to impact our culture and even affect the direction of our country back toward God, end of quote. In the United States today, he asserted, quote, good is being called evil and vice versa. Evil is not just operating behind the scenes, it's right there in our faces. Lawlessness, post-term abortions, you name it, end of quote. By the way, post-term abortions never existed. Post-term abortions. Yeah, more bullshit from the conservatives. Fogle went on to criticize his local Spokane City Council for allegedly underfunding the police while spending money on gay pride-themed murals. Despite the apolitical front, the CCM industry has a major anti-LGBTQ problem. Selmer Baldridge said this, quote, I went to this meeting with a pretty big-time CCM music manager, and he was like, you got to stop baiting K-Love, end of quote. Semler, who is queer, has tried repeatedly to get her music on K-Love, but it's never happened, not even when her 2021 album Preacher's Kid topped Apple's Christian chart. While many of her songs deal with doubt and the realities of being a queer Christian, topics K-Love doesn't touch, some of her songs are just plain worship music, poppy, repetitive, and perfect, she says, for K-Love. Semler says she tried to capture the classic CCM sound on her song Raise Up, but apparently it still sounded too gay. Last year, as her song Faith was on its way to number 1 on the iTunes Christian chart, she took to X, formerly Twitter, to ask K-Love if it would play the explosive single. They never even gave her the time of day. She said, quote, it's just so blatant their exclusion of LGBTQ people, end of quote. Though EMF hasn't spoken ill of Christian artists who have come out, several queer artists have lost airtime on Christian radio after opening up about their sexuality. Even so, Semler wishes she and other queer Christian artists could have the platform that K-Love would give her. She said, quote, I've had some people on the inside at EMF that are like, we're affirming, we're making progress, hang tight, hold tight. But I don't know how much I'm willing to wait for that at this stage of my life, end of quote. The more Semler dives into the mainstream world of Christian rock, the more she is turned off by it. And not just for its inability to support LGBTQ artists. She recently crashed a CCM awards ceremony in Nashville called the Dove Awards. She says, quote, "The nicest cars I've seen in my life were at the Dove Awards. We were talking about Jesus the whole time, and I was like, he'd hate it here," end of quote. Well, he would. Though few and far between, other Christians have questioned the plush material conditions of industry leaders and EMF executives. In 2016, Warren Throckmorton, a retired psychology professor in Pennsylvania and evangelical blogger with a defiant streak, whose professional headshot looks straight out of the Blues Brothers, started blogging about red flags he heard on K-Love's fundraising drives. He never had a bone to pick with K-Love before. He lived within earshot of 3 K-Love stations. His wife and his kids listened. As a member of his church band, he had learned to play many of the songs at the request of his younger congregants. But Throckmorton couldn't defend the on-air host who praised a hard-up caller who donated to K-Love rather than paying an outstanding bill. And he found K-Love's repeated asks for an easy gift of $40 a month disingenuous, especially when the nationwide syndicated host would say things like, "Help keep K-Love on the air in your area." Throckmorton said, quote, "They weren't using that money to keep local stations on the air. They were using that money to buy up new stations. It seems like less ministry and more business," end of quote. Every weekday afternoon at 3 these days, DJ Mistress Carrie takes the mic at rock radio station The Pike in Worcester, a small city an hour west of Boston. It's a good gig, but her old Boston listeners can't hear it on the radios. The signal cuts out well beyond city limits on the Mass Turnpike. Sitting in her car outside her new workplace, though, she can easily pick up the massive K-Love signal that replaced WAAF. And just in case one station in the Boston area wasn't enough, EMF bought a second signal there in 2022, giving K-Love extra reach into the North Shore and Gloucester. Like the stations that replaced WAAF, it's just another unmanned transmitter, rebroadcasting the same bland Christian rock from California and spreading its conservative pop culture alternative even farther. Today, the Educational Media Foundation is everywhere. You can hear it on the air from New York to San Francisco or tune in on the K-Love and Air One apps. Starting at $1,148, you can join the K-Love Friends and Family Cruise. The company had a growth spurt during the pandemic, taking advantage of the advertising decline that hit commercial radio stations. Last year, EMF bought out stations in Memphis, Buffalo, Atlantic City, and dozens of other cities across the country. EMF gives even the biggest for-profit media conglomerates a run for their money. Just a handful of years ago, it bought 6 big city stations from Cumulus, the country's third-largest station holder, for $103.5 million. And true community broadcasters have even less of a chance in the face of EMF's buying sprees, especially when the billion-dollar organization can offer iHeart-level prices for neighborhood stations. Even as the media industry has grown increasingly consolidated, the FCC has held on to one major policy to give small broadcasters a ghost of a chance and to keep any one company from having too much sway over the public. To this day, it is illegal for one single company to own more than 5 AM or 5 FM stations in any one city. But there's a catch, according to URIC, a loophole for non-commercial broadcasters. The FCC never applied this ownership cap to nonprofits. It also doesn't count for translators, the meat of EMF's explosive growth toward those totals. URIC says, quote, "In the San Jose area, they're on 8 FM frequencies," end of quote. Today, a small number of community media activists are still asking the FCC to limit the number of translators a single company could own, or to cap the number of frequencies a nonprofit can occupy in a single city, as it does with for-profits. But with the agency focused on things like internet access and digital privacy, radio, despite still being listened to by more than 4 out of every 5 Americans each week, often gets overlooked. And EMF doesn't appear to be raising eyebrows at the commission. It has no flashy violations, no big lawsuits. To URIC, it feels like a David versus Goliath fight, but Goliath keeps winning. Those in the CCM industry know that the genre is a punchline for most Americans. Many people that the author of the piece spoke with said this may work to EMF's advantage, that the organization evades scrutiny with the help of intentionally prosaic facade cloaking its money-stacking, culture-flattening project in banality. And this is nothing new for the group. When Fogel first incorporated the organization, it was called Christian Media Ministries. But before the first station launched, Fogel met with an attorney who helped churches to navigate the turbulent waters of the FCC. The attorney suggested that he change the organization's name to the Educational Media Foundation. Fogel would later say that he felt the name was bland and boring, but Fogel recalled that the attorney said that was actually a good thing. If the country's second largest radio station was still named Christian Media Ministries, perhaps others would have taken notice. Leah Payne warns critics against mistaking kitsch for a lack of importance and influence. The politicking and legislation of the religious right, she says, is the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it is a whole culture that includes not just politics but entertainment, arts, and music. Those who hold the CCM cards are wielding conservative soft power. Payne says of those shaping the industry, quote, if it were not attentive to them, we're going to miss out on a lot, end of quote. But for now, EMF and the Christian rock industry, it seems, are happy to be a joke if it keeps scrutinizing eyes off of them. Urich said, quote, the public just doesn't really care what they're doing, end of quote. And right there is the problem, is that the public doesn't know what's going on. This is why I read this piece on the air and have taken up just about 50 minutes of this show, 45 to 50 minutes of this show. It's because I want you to know what in the hell is actually going on with these conservative Christians. They're trying to take over society by any means necessary, whether it's forcing prayer in school or buying out radio stations. You better be aware of what's going on. And if you want to stop it, you better do it now, because they're getting bigger. They're getting much bigger. And that's going against the grain of this latest survey. This is Jason DeRose writing for National Public Radio. This is January 24th. When Americans are asked to check a box indicating their religious affiliation, 28% now check none. A new study from Pew Research finds that the religiously unaffiliated, a group comprised of atheists, agnostics, and those who say their religion is nothing in particular, is now the largest cohort in the United States. They're more prevalent among American adults than Catholics or evangelical Protestants. Back in 2007, nuns made up just 16% of Americans, but Pew's new survey of more than 3,300 U.S. adults shows that number has now risen dramatically. Researchers refer to this group as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Pew asked respondents what, if anything, they believe. The research organization found that nuns are not a uniform group. Most nuns believe in God or another higher power, but very few attend any kind of religious service. They aren't all anti-religious. Most nuns say religion does more harm, but many also think it does some good. It does good. Thomas de Torquemada, pulling out the guts of non-believers. That's where the phrase, somebody doesn't have enough guts, comes from. Unbelievable. Most have more positive views of science than those who are religiously affiliated. However, they reject the idea that science can explain everything. Well, even I know science doesn't explain it, but it explains a lot. It explains a lot. Gregory Smith at Pew was the lead researcher on the study titled Religious Nuns in America, Who They Are and What They Believe. He says the growth of nuns could affect American public life. Smith says, quote, we know politically, for example, that religious nuns are very distinctive. They are among the most strongly and consistently liberal and democratic constituencies in the United States, end of quote. And that could change electoral politics in the coming decades. That's great news right there. The political power of white evangelicals has been well reported in recent decades, but their numbers are shrinking, while the number of the more liberal nuns is on the rise. However, Smith points out that nuns are also less civically engaged than those who identify with a religion. They're less likely to vote. So while they identify as Democrats, getting them to the polls on Election Day may prove to be a challenge, and that's the unfortunate part. Within the nuns, however, atheists and agnostics are more likely to be politically and civically engaged, whereas those who responded that their religion is nothing in particular are far less likely to vote. I would call those people what's the word I'm looking for? They're more milquetoast, I guess. They're more laissez-faire, I guess, would be another way to put it. Pew also found that overall nuns are less likely to volunteer in their local communities than religiously affiliated adults. That's a bad part right there. According to Pew, nuns tend to be young, white, and male. 69% of them are under the age of 50. 63% are white. So there you go, folks. Yep, so none of the above is now number one in this country. And the religious conservatives in this country are scared to death of it. That's why you have EMF buying up radio stations left and right all across this country. That's why you have the religious taking over the Republican Party. It's just unreal, folks. They're scared. They're petrified. They're afraid that their lifestyle is going to go away, that maybe religion will go away, maybe the Bible will go away. God, wouldn't that be nice? Just like I said last week, the John Lennon song, Imagine. Imagine no religion too. Beautiful. That is beautiful in my book. All right. Well, we might as well get on to some other stories that we need to talk about. Donald Trump won New Hampshire. Not a big surprise there. Although he did win by less of a margin than he was projected to, which is really odd. Could this be a uprising of sorts for Nikki Haley? Could she be buoyed by this? Possibly. I doubt it, though. A lot of Republicans are too far in the pocket for Trump, or too far in the manure pit for Trump is probably the best way to put them. All right, and then I've got, this is from, I actually got this article. It was published by the Morning Sun out of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. This is based out of, this is Katie Langford. This originally was written for the Denver Post, published January 19th. Hours after the Ouray County Plain Dealer in southwest Colorado published a story detailing the alleged violent sexual assault of a teenage girl at the Ouray police chief's house, someone stole hundreds of copies out of nearly every newspaper rack across the county, according to publishers. Wow, they're scared that that story is going to get out. The front page story, written by co-publisher Aaron McIntyre, broke the news that 3 men were arrested on suspicion of sexually assaulting a 17-year-old girl multiple times during a late-night party at the home of Ouray Police Chief Jeff Wood in May. Co-publisher Mike Wiggins wrote on X, the former Twitter, on Thursday, quote, "Someone didn't like this edition of the paper," end of quote. Continues, quote, "Guess which article? So they stole nearly every newspaper out of our racks in Ouray County. If you hope to silence or intimidate us, you failed miserably. We'll find out who did this, and another press run is imminent," end of quote. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation reports that 20-year-old Gabriel Trujillo, 18-year-old Ashton Whittington, and a third man were arrested on suspicion of sexual assault. The agency did not name the third man because he was a juvenile at the time of the incident. Trujillo was 19 at the time of the assault. According to the Plain Dealer, the girl told investigators she was raped at least 3 times after passing out at the party. She screamed and fought back while people, including Wood, were asleep in the home. Someone knocked on the bathroom door during one of the assaults, the girl told investigators, causing one of the suspects to restrain her and try to cover her mouth. Evidence collected through a sexual assault examination matched Trujillo and the third suspect, according to the Plain Dealer. Trujillo told investigators the girl was a pathological liar and crazy, but later admitted to having sex with her, according to the Plain Dealer. Arrest warrants in the case have been sealed, according to the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. All 3 suspects have posted bail and have been released from jail, according to the Plain Dealer. McIntyre and Wiggins posted a photo of an empty newspaper rack on the Plain Dealer's Facebook page just before noon Thursday and wrote that someone cleared out most of the newspaper racks in the county sometime between Wednesday night and early Thursday morning. In a newsletter published Thursday night, McIntyre said all but one of the Plain Dealer's newspaper racks were emptied. McIntyre wrote, quote, "From what we know so far, it seems this person put in 4 quarters and took all the papers at these racks. It's pretty clear that someone didn't want the community to read the news this week." End of quote. McIntyre and Wiggins worked with the printing press run by the Montrose Daily Press to print another run of the weekly paper on Thursday night. McIntyre wrote, quote, "Whoever did this does not understand that stealing newspapers doesn't stop a story. We're not going to stop doing our job, which is to shine light on important issues in our community and keep you informed. This person is not going to shut down the freedom of the press by stealing a few hundred newspapers. Our community won't stand for it, and we won't either. If you meant to intimidate us, you just strengthened our resolve." End of quote. And I would say, in my opinion, it was probably the police chief himself who took all the papers, or one of his underlings. You want my opinion on it, which I'm entitled to my opinion. If it turns out to be somebody else not affiliated, then I will apologize on the air. But until then, I'm entitled to my opinion. And I would say that the cops did it because they don't want anybody questioning their power. And that's all that it is a question of power. Who's got the power? It's just unreal, folks. It's absolutely unreal. All right, I've got one more story that I want to get to. This was just published on January 24th. This is Hallelujah Hadero writing for the Associated Press out of New York City. This is huge for privacy advocates. Listen to this. Amazon-owned Ring doorbells will stop allowing police departments to request doorbell camera footage from users, marking an end to a feature that has drawn criticism from privacy advocates. In a blog post Wednesday, Ring said it will sunset the Request for Assistance tool, which allows police departments and other public safety agencies to request and receive video captured by the doorbell cameras through Ring's Neighbors app. The company did not provide a reason for the change, which will be effective starting this week. Eric Kuhn, the head of Neighbors, said in the announcement that law enforcement agencies will still be able to make public posts in the Neighbors app. Police and other agencies can also still use the app to share helpful safety tips, updates, and community events. The update is the latest restriction Ring has made to police activity on the Neighbors app following concerns raised by privacy watchdogs about the company's relationship with police departments across the country. Critics have stressed the proliferation of these relationships and users' ability to report what they see as suspicious behavior can change neighborhoods into a place of constant surveillance and lead to more instances of racial profiling. In a bid to increase transparency, Ring changed its policy in 2021 to make police requests publicly visible through its Neighbors app. Previously, law enforcement agencies were able to send Ring owners who live near an area of an active investigation private emails requesting video footage. So this is big news, folks. Well, that music means we are out of time for this week. We're going to have an article that we're going to share with you next week that Jack Prince sent me. It has to do with a House Bill 5 in Kentucky that's going to allow people to basically outlaw homelessness and to shoot homeless people on private property if they're loitering. Unreal. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.